Smell, one of the most vital senses a human can possess, by Alyssa Bertzos. Smell is also known as olfaction. It is detected by thousands of chemoreceptors located in the upper wall of the nasal cavities. Smell is something that is not visible to the naked eye. There are tiny molecules of chemicals such as food, flowers, fire, and much more that float through the air. This chemical is classified as odor. Odors aren't a single scent, but whole mixtures that travel through the air to your nose. Not everyone is fortunate enough to have the ability to smell like most of us. In history, there are two well-known theories of smell. The first one is by Democritus, saying, "The smell of an object is due to evaporated molecules that terminate from them." The second one is known by Aristotle, saying that odors are detected when the cold sense of smell meet hot smoke or steam from the object being smelled. By the modern theory, Democritus was right. Moving on to the anatomy of the nose. The nasal cavity consists of two extensive chambers plus their associated sinuses. The two main chambers are separated by a midline wall called the nasal septum. In humans, the nose has three functions. It forms a resonating cavity for the voice, it houses the organ that enables us to sense odors, and importantly, it is the upper part of the respiratory tract. As such, functions to filter warm and moistened inhaled air before it reaches the lungs. The nostrils, also known as the anterior nares, is guarded by a collection of long bristle-like hairs that prevent large airborne objects, like insects, from entering the nose. Smaller particles like pollen and dust flow past the hairs and are trapped in a layer of sticky mucus that covers the internal lining of the nose. The nasal cavities are lined by a mucous membrane. The mucous membrane is a delicate layer of cells that is constantly moistened by secreted watery fluid. Its moisture is transferred to the air and is passed through the nasal cavity. The nasal septum is relatively featureless. Deep to its mucous membrane is an extensive network of blood vessels. These blood vessels bring warm blood to the surface to enable mucosal to warm inhaled air as it passes by. In addition, it keeps the mucosal well supplied with nutrients. No less than 5 arteries meet with each other in the septum. They branch from the posterior and anterior ethmoidal arteries, the superior labial artery, the greater palatine artery, and the sphenopalatine artery. These create an area of dense vasculation called Hasselbalch's area that is prone to drying and trauma, leading to nosebleeds. Sensory innervation of nasal septum is supplied by the first and second branches of the trigeminal nerve. The anterior ethmoidal nerve supplies the answer of the superior half of the septum, while the nasal palatine nerve supplies the posterior inferior half. A small area around the external nares is supplied by internal nasal branches of infraorbital nerve. The nasal palatine nerve passes through the incisive foramen to supply the interior aspect of the palate. The skeleton of the nasal septum is partly bone and cartilage. The bony part of the nose is formed by the perpendicular plate of ethmoidal bone, vomerine bone, the palatine bone, and maxilla bone. Interiorly, the nose is formed by mainly the septal cartilage, vomerine cartilage, and alar cartilage. The advantage of having cartilage in the part of the nose that protrudes from the face is that cartilage is flexible. So when the nose is moved around, it bends rather than breaks. The lateral wall of the nasal cavity has a much more complicated anatomy than the septum. 3 elevations, the superior, middle, and inferior conchae, narrow the nasal passages and create a large surface area, forcing inhaled air to swirl over them. The sensory receptors for smell are located in the olfactory epithelium at the superior aspect of the nose. Odors and inhaled air are bound by the receptor cells, which in turn signal the olfactory bulb. The 4 major sinuses, the frontal ethmoidal, the sphenoidal, and maxillary sinuses, are continuous with the nasal cavity. The openings through which the sinuses communicate with the nasal cavity are obscured by the conchae, but are visible by the removal of the conchae. The frontal sinus drains through a funnel-like tunnel to the upper end of the hiatus semilunaris. The ethmoidal air cells drain into the nasal cavity in at least 3 locations. The anterior cells drain anterior to the hiatus semilunaris. The middle air cells drain into 1 or more openings in a bubble-like structure, and the posterior air cells drain by 1 or more openings into the superior meatus. The sphenoidal air sinus drains through 1 or 2 openings into the spheno ethmoidal sinus. The maxillary sinus drains into the middle meatus to an opening in the inferior part of the hiatus. There's a 5th opening in the nose called the nasolacrimal duct. This duct carries overflow tears from the eye through the nasal cavity, which is why our noses run when we cry. Moving on to diseases. One disease is called anosmia, and this is a lack of function in olfaction, or in other words, an inability to perceive odors. Anosmia may be temporary but traumatic. It can also be permanent. It can be caused by chronic meningitis and neurosyphilis that would increase pressure over a long period of time. Dysosmia, also known as olfactory dysfunction, is the impairment of olfactory stimuli processing, leading to an altered sense of smell. These dysfunctions can be present in a variety of ways, such as the stimuli not activating the olfactory bulb, some odors being interpreted as other odors, or hallucinations of smell. Parosmia is an olfactory dysfunction that is characterized by the inability of the brain to properly identify an odor's natural smell. What happens instead is that the natural odor is transcribed into what is most often described as an unpleasant aroma, typically a burned, rotting, fecal, or chemical smell. There are instances, however, of pleasant odors. This is more specifically called eosmia.